That snuck up on us real quick.
We're
Hello.
live. Calling Chris Anderson in London. How are you?
I'm fine. This is Chris Anderson, London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago. And how are you?
I'm doing okay, and we welcome to everybody who is hopefully going to take a moment or two to join us and pile in. Chris, I note that there were Veterans Day, or I should say Armistice Day ceremonies in London today.
Yep. It's usually the really great parade where everybody marches down the mall to the cenotaph, all the veterans, and it's the 100th anniversary of the dedication of the cenotaph. So it was a much reduced ceremony this year. I heard that there were 26 veterans that they allowed to march. So it was sad to see, but I'm happy that they honored it. But one of the things that was pretty neat about that event is, of course, there's a big ceremony at Westminster Abbey, usually afterwards. And the lawn outside of Westminster Abbey is always decorated with those little British memorial crosses, and each regiment has their own little section.
Yeah.
And I was there earlier this week before this most current lockdown, and I noticed for the first time that there's a small section of the lawn there dedicated to Americans who fought with the British. So there's some American memorial crosses there, particularly to Eagle Squadron veterans. So
It's nice that they remembered that there were some Americans involved, so that's excellent.
Well, no, but I mean Americans that served in British uniform.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind everybody that we're here every Sunday talking about history, and available on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours website are all the previous shows we've done, and we seem to be building an audience, Chris. So with that thought in mind, I think it's time for us to play... And the bar is open.
The bell.
Do you have a drink?
I do.
Have a drink
World War One. It's got to be wine.
Okay. Well, I'm doing a Belgian beer in honor of
very good.
Belgium. Speaking of World War One, I think that probably most people are not aware that 1 out of 10 American soldiers who went to fight over there in World War One were African American. 1 out of 10 American soldiers, and that there were in fact 2 entire combat divisions with African American soldiers in them, segregated divisions that fought in France, as well as a huge number of people working in the supply services and doing a critical job for the entire expeditionary force. And these are not the only people of color who are fighting in World War I. We have folks from colonial French troops. We have Indian troops. And for the story of the Americans, African Americans in World War I is a story of racism and heroism. It's a story of triumph and tragedy, both at home and in Europe. And it is, I think the 2 questions that really come up in this story are, what did they do? What did they accomplish in Europe? And then what was the impact once folks came back home? And one historian, as you told me, Chris, this morning, suggested that World War I was the seminal event of the 20th century for African Americans. So obviously it's a pretty important story, but it's also a somewhat forgotten story with a mixed legacy. It was spotlighted recently by an exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian called We Return Fighting. And our guest today was the curator of that exhibit. Krewasky Salter is a retired colonel in the United States Army. He was a guest curator for the Smithsonian, and he is the executive director of the First Division Museum. I have to remember all this stuff. The First Division Museum in Wheaton, Illinois, at Cantini Park. And Krewasky, you are a man of many hats. Welcome to History Happy Hour.
Welcome,
well, thank you for having me.
We're really glad that you're here. And I'd like to start off, the exhibit that you curated is entitled We Return Fighting, and that's a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, and it comes from a an editorial he wrote in the crisis in 1919, great African-American leader. And he said, we return from fighting, we return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why. So that is his interpretation of this story from 1 year after the end of the war, or less than 1 year. But I would ask you, Krewasky, to start us off, give us an overview of the story of African Americans in World War I and why it is important.
Well, the overview, to go to your title, We Return Fighting, we named the exhibition We Return Fighting, and it opened in 1919 because World War I, the importance of World War I was not only the participation of African Americans in the war, but what they were able to use the war as a platform for after the war. And so as a people, if you go fight for your country, when you return, you expect a level of equality, a level of democracy. And so W.E.B. Du Bois was the scholar that convinced most African Americans to close ranks shoulder to shoulder with their white counterparts and fight in the war. And then when they came back from the war, that equality, that democracy was not waiting for them. And so that's why he also changed his tune when he wrote We Return Fighting in the Crisis in May of 1919. And he goes on, to say that, we would be cowards and fools if we didn't fight for democracy. So for us at the Smithsonian, we felt that it was important to talk not only about the African-American military experience, but the African-American experience. And that's key. If you notice, there's not the word military in the title. It's the African-American experience. And so the main portion of the exhibition is what happened afterwards. And so the exhibition is in three parts. There's a before the war. So we start actually in 1865 at the end of the American Civil War, because we felt it important to set the stage for what life was like for African Americans after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, after the Civil War. So you paint that picture of separate but equal, mob violence, the rise in lynchings, the inequality. And yet the President of the United States on 2 April goes before Congress and says something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, we as Americans must fight to make the world safe for democracy. And many African Americans believe that, and certainly Du Bois. So African Americans fight. If you're fighting to make the world safe for democracy, then certainly the United States is going to be safe for democracy when you come back, and it wasn't. And so that's what We Return Fighting is all about. We fought in the war. Now we need to fight after the war. And I'll just close with this, not to be long-winded. It is the premise, and that's why the book has a different long title, World War I and the Shaping of Modern Day Black Identity, because it was the World War II generation that executed the civil rights movement. But I'm a firm believer, and so are a lot of scholars, that it was the World War I generation that planted the seeds for the World War II generation, when those seeds germinated and they executed. And we have several people in the exhibition we can talk about later on that really points to that.
Krewasky, if you could expand on that, because I think one of the misconceptions people have, or our lack of knowledge, is coming out of all of this scholarship, looking at World War I, is this idea that it's the long civil rights movement. It's a much longer struggle, that this didn't just pop out of the ground in the 1950s. So maybe you could kind of explain a little bit, when people say the long civil rights movement, what do they mean by that?
Yeah, the long civil rights movement, and I'll plant this seed, that Reconstruction really ended. So for those of us as historians, we generally think of Reconstruction as beginning either in 1863, 1865, or 1867, and ending in 1870 1876 or 1877 with the compromise that put President Rutherford B. Hayes into office. But some of us argue that we are still reconstructing this country. And it's the same with the civil rights movement. So although you can really say that the seeds were planted in World War I, the seeds were certainly planted going back, and some could argue as early as the American Civil War, because we're going to talk about New Negro in a second. And we're going to talk about the post-World War I New Negro. But the first time, as far as I can find, the term New Negro being mentioned is in 1895. And it was an intellectual economic growth of New Negro. So as a historian, you all know this better than I, history is very complex.
Yep.
And so unless there is a certain date, like the 4th of July is the 4th of July, you can argue when did the civil rights movement really start, and you can argue when did Reconstruction really end.
Yeah.
And Krewasky, I mean, one could also extend this discussion if we focus for a little bit on the military aspect here. The United States develops ends up sending two combat divisions, the 92nd and 93rd, to France. But that development is also not something that starts on a single day. It has kind of a little trail of what happened before that to lead to that. And then those divisions have very, very different experiences.
Exactly. Yeah, so you're talking about the 92nd and the 93rd Division. And so in World War I, and I think you alluded to this, that 1 in 10 American soldiers that went overseas were African Americans. So during World War I, roughly 4 million Americans serve in uniform, and roughly 2 million Americans deploy overseas. During World War I, roughly 400,000, this is one of the easiest numbers for me to remember because it's almost 10% exactly. More than 400,000 African Americans served in the military, and nearly 200,000 of them deploy overseas. And of those, about 80% were services of supply, but about 20%, almost 40%, were the African American combat soldiers in the 92nd and the 93rd Division. So the 92nd Division was mainly made up of draftees, and it was the African American officers were the ones that graduated from Fort Des Moines. The 93rd Division was largely made up of National Guard units, so go to the lineage. So the 369th was born out of the 15th New York, which is a National Guard unit established only in 1916, although there have been arguments for more than a decade, because they were arguing for what was already going on here where I am now in Chicagoland. The 370th was the 8th Illinois, which was the African American unit, National Guard unit here in Illinois, which has roots as far back as 1869, 70, 71, but hard roots in the 1890s. They actually served during the Spanish-American War, and some of them are on the frontier. And then the 372nd was made up of a conglomeration of National Guard units from different parts of the nation. But there was also a state National Guard unit, or a draftee unit from South Carolina, which was the 372nd, so much different. And then, of course, the 92nd, and we may talk about this later, and the differences, they fought under the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, when the fighting started. And the 93rd Division was given to the French. And so that's one thing I always try to, correct when people say that the U.S. gave the African American units to the French. It was really only a small part of them. It was the 93rd Division, and they had much different experiences because of who they fought for and who they served with.
Mm-hmm. Well, Krewasky, if you could, I have a great interest in the 369th because a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, my first job was as a historian for the National Guard. So obviously, being a National Guard unit, it's prominent in that story. But if you could talk a little bit about just the effort that goes into, or that the African American community put into creating this militia unit, because, you know, in the case of what was the 15th New York, they really had to fight for the right to even form this unit before the war even starts.
Right. Now, I alluded to it, decades in the making. And I can't, go back to the exact year, but the state of New York and the African American community, and it mainly was the African American community and some of their white supporters, have been arguing for more than a decade for an African American National Guard unit. But a National Guard unit is a state unit, it's very political. And so what really pushed it forward was the fact that we are going to enter World War I, but also Colonel William Hayward was selected to be the commander of that unit, and he was very well connected, socially, politically connected. He was from the Midwest, but had been in New York for a long time. And when he was selected, that was part of the push that galvanized folks who were not supportive of African Americans. And so I'll interject this really quick too, because there has always been a long fear of giving Black men weapons.
Right.
And so if you train a person to fight, and I'll jump to the history and go to a quote in 1940 by William Hastings, who says something to the effect, you can't train a man to fight for your country and then expect him to be a craven. I'm paraphrasing. And so that was always a part of it. Now, William Hastings, Hayward, I believe, William Hayward, I'm getting the Hastings and the Williams mixed up.
And I'll jump in, Krewasky, that's William Hayward there on the left, and
on the left.
Hamilton Fish, I think, on the right, who also served as an officer in that unit.
Right. And for those of you in New York, you know the background and the history of Hamilton Fish. So a part of it, too, is I always talk about African Americans and their white supporters. And so the 15th New York is finally established. But what Colonel Hayward does is he selects also some of those African Americans who had been a part of this movement, such as an officer named Napoleon, I'm forgetting his last name, but we talk about him in the book. And he also selects James Reese Europe to help be a recruiter. And so that's how New York is formed now. The 8th Illinois goes back to post-Civil War. And some of the state units had also been in existence, like Washington, D.C. had a long-serving National Guard, which is one of the National Guard units that became a part of the 372nd. Up in Massachusetts, there was a National Guard unit that was one of the units that became a part of the 372nd. And that goes to the fact that these units, too, were also, mixtures and new formings of units, and that played into some of the way they performed overseas. So if I'm going too far off track, you guys let me know. I participated in one of these conversations, and you forgot to also, you said, Krewasky, you can bring a beverage of your choice. So I'm breaking two rules at home. I don't sit around the house on Sunday afternoon wearing a tie, and I don't drink before I give presentations. But I do have my Belgian beer as well. So,
yes, is that a cherry Belgian beer, a
Framboise?
Yeah. So we're sorry. I hadn't seen a drink in your hand, so I didn't want to put you on the spot, and we were busy dealing with that technical stuff beforehand, so we didn't get a chance to ask you. So it's all my fault.
I have one.
Along with my incredible inability, despite having heard it many times, to say Du Bois's name correctly. I always revert to the incorrect pronunciation, so thank you for, in a very gentlemanly way, correcting my mispronunciation there. It's beautifully done. So... let's talk about a little bit. I mean, the 369th, which is also called the Harlem Hellfighters, is their nickname, and they are serving along. They actually are the first unit to American unit to go in and serve with the French and be fighting. They end up, I think, being the longest serving American unit. That's the wrong picture there. The longest serving American unit on the front lines, and they have quite a combat record, and some individuals in that unit, including someone named Freddie Stowers, who really make a very impressive combat record, even if it's not completely recognized the way it should be right away. So tell us a little bit more about that.
I do want to say a couple of things on the historical point. So they were the first African American infantry regiment to be deployed. There were American regiments that had arrived in Europe in late 1917, but African Americans were on the front end because there were stevedore African Americans who went in the summer of 1917. So the 369th was the first African American regiment to serve overseas or to arrive in country. And as far as being in the trenches, they were the longest serving regiment. And as a historian, as you guys know, and in your area, you always try to point these things out so people don't think that you're saying it was the longest serving unit. It was the longest serving unit of its size, so it was a regiment. And they never really fought. Pardon me?
191 days on
191 days as a regiment from the time they were put into the trenches and from the time they came out. And of course, so the division is over the regiment, and of course you have a brigade in between, so they served 191 days. And so some of the individuals that fought, so Freddie Stowers was actually, I believe, in the 371st.
Okay, so I've totally blown this.
No, well, so Henry Johnson was in the 369th, but Freddie Stowers, but I know why we're talking about Freddie Stowers is because he's one of the Medal of Honor recipients. He is the first African American to be awarded a Medal of Honor during the American during the Great War, and that is his final resting place in the Meuse-Argonne American Battlefield Monument Cemetery. And luckily, just like you, Chris and Rick, I've done some staff rides and some journeys. I was fortunate enough to be invited as a Smithsonian expert, and I took a group over there, and I have actually visited his site. But, you know, he's a Medal of Honor recipient, but it's not awarded until 1991. And so we can talk about, you know, the feat that he did, and I've been to the place, and we can talk about it, but the key is, why does it take so long? Why does it take so long? The era of separate but equal. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson at the Supreme Court level was passed in 1896. That's the bookend. Now, we know separate but equal. We talk about dates, what's going on before that. The bookend that ends Plessy versus Ferguson is Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. Now, of course, we know it goes into the 60s and early 70s before schools are integrated, but when you go to this period, not a single African American was awarded the Medal of Honor during the era of World War I. Not one. We have two now. Not a single African American was awarded the Medal of Honor during the era of World War II. The 7 World War II Medal of Honor recipients were awarded in 1997. And those were all because of correcting injustices of the past, which is why what you gentlemen are doing right now, especially with this show and this topic and inviting me, I really do thank you for inviting me, is we have to talk about these because these also play into this term that's been bounced around, and people say that systemic racism exists and some say it don't exist. But there were individuals who were awarded the Medals of Honor in World War I and World War II, and their lives change and go on a different upward path. What if Freddie Stowers or Henry Johnson, who was in the 369th, were actually awarded their Medal of Honor in 1919? Perhaps Henry Johnson would not have died in a state of penury in 1929. Those Medal of Honor recipients in World War II, and I can talk about a few of those. So it's perhaps, and the good thing is some of that is being redressed today. There is a center called the George S. Robb Center out at Park University, a suburb of Kansas City, where they are now looking with bipartisan support. It was born out of the Centennial Commission, so you gentlemen may have heard of it. And the Centennial Commission collapsed, so the Rob S. George Center picked this up. And they are now looking at Asian Pacific Americans, Hispanic Americans, Jewish Americans, Native Americans, and African Americans who the criteria is you were awarded a Distinguished Service Cross, that's the first criteria, or somewhere you were put in for a Medal of Honor, such as Butler, we talk about him in the book, who was put in for a Medal of Honor and didn't receive it. And right now that number is 202. So there were a couple of questions there. I hope I answered the gist of what you were getting at.
No, thank you. And let me just, Chris, before we go back to you, I want to bring in a comment here that
Absolutely.
one of our guests made. And again, I apologize for mixing up the regiment that Freddie Stowers was in. That's 2 strikes against me on this show. If I get one more wrong, I'm going to have to mute myself for the rest of the show. Chris, good news for you. But Nancy points out that there's an editorial today in the New York Times called "A Hero in the Jim Crow Navy" about Dory Miller. And of course, Dory Miller at Pearl Harbor. It's a example of what we're talking about. You know, he has not been honored that way, even though they've now named a super carrier in his honor, but still doesn't have kind of a recognition for valor that perhaps he deserves.
Only 7 in World War II. There are many others. It's not only Dory Miller right now in World War II. There's also a gentleman by the name of Waverly Woodson. And so this is key where I am now. So Waverly Woodson, and it goes to what we were talking about. If you watch a movie about D-Day, and Chris, I know you know this better than I, and you don't see African-American soldiers on the beach, then that's Hollywood licensing that did not put them there. Right. Because there was the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, which some of those soldiers landed on the first wave on the beaches with the namesake of the museum I'm at, with the 1st Infantry Division. The 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Division, as you all know, were the 2 lead divisions on Utah and Omaha Beach. And there were African-American medics, and there was one being considered for the Medal of Honor as well. So it's not only Dory Miller, it's a few others. And so hopefully,
right. And we have a rule on this show that anytime we mention the Ghost Army, we have to take a drink. And I would say that anytime that you mention the 1st Division, we're going to have to take a drink as well.
You're talking about me, see. So I am going to break a rule. Those of you who know that I have a rule not to drink when I speak, but this is a history happy hour.
Exactly.
So I'll take a little
And you're representing the museum, Krewasky.
History is being made as we speak.
Can we segue a little bit to the 1st Infantry Division Museum, or the 1st Division Museum, and talk about Robert R. McCormick?
Absolutely.
Well, sure, because there's a World War I connection there as well. And we will come back to our main topic, but we'll go where you want to go.
Yeah, and so right now, I do have the fortune to be the executive director of the 1st Division Museum out at Cantigny Park, and you all know that that's the different way that the French pronounce it, but that's the way it's been pronounced here for decades. So people who are saying he's pronouncing it wrong, we do pronounce it Cantigny Park. But Robert R. McCormick was the longtime editor of the Chicago, there he is, the Chicago Tribune. I believe it was from 1919 to 1955 that he was at the helm, but his history goes back, I call it the century bookends. His grandfather, his mother's father, Joseph Medill, bought a paper in 1855, which became the Chicago Tribune. Medill has his own history. And so, long story short, it passes on to one of his daughters, which is Robert's mother. And Robert, the Red Oak Farm passes on to his mother. And Robert picks up this property called Red Oak Farm through his mother, who his grandfather had purchased and built a house in the 1890s. And so Robert is one of those individuals, just like the Roosevelts and a lot of people a century ago. Americans were patriotic. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, if you will. Matter of fact, one of the many books I'm reading is Poor Little Rich Boy. But he joins the Illinois National Guard. He serves, he actually goes overseas in a diplomatic role, if you will, in 1915. He's on the Mexican border, but he also serves in World War I, and he ends up in the 1st Division. And it's the 1st Division, just like it's the 82nd Division, because we don't put the monikers infantry, airborne, cavalry, and armor until around 1939, 40, 42. I know one of you guys can get the exact year correct, but it's only the 1st Division. And so they fight one of the first big battles that U.S. soldier fights, which shows everybody that, yes, the U.S. came in late, but they can fight. Robert R. McCormick was a major as a artillery officer in that battle. He was so touched by his service in World War One, and he loved veterans for the rest of his life, that he came back and named a property that his grandfather bought called Red Oak Farm. That is what Cantigny is. And when he passed away in 1955, and the foundation that we are so fortunate to still have around today, a part of his will and the trust was that there would be, a museum, one dedicated at least to military history, and his house is a museum partially as well. And so that's why it's named Cantigny. And two different announcements. So I'm officially the former inaugural curator at the Smithsonian because my 9-year contract finally ended in September. And as of 5 years ago, the reason I'm reading a lot more on McCormick is as of 5 weeks ago, we're going to open up the new McCormick Museum, and that's going to be under my guidance and supervision as well. So I'm looking forward to being over the 1st Division Museum and also the McCormick Museum.
Well, I think it should have been part of the fine print, Krewasky, though, that you have to grow a mustache like McCormick.
There are pictures somewhere. I was on CBS this morning about a year and a half ago. It was in the winter, and the first beard I ever tried, I didn't know I could grow one because in the military, and I never tried to grow one until 7 years. And I was watching it the other day. So maybe I'll try to do handlebars the next time.
Well, this would have
take your advice.
This would have been a good time in the last 6 months to try for a beard or a mustache. And I just want to, before we get back and give Chris the opportunity to quiz you again on our topic, to say that we have both been at the First Division Museum in Cantigny Park. And that is in the Battle of the Bulge display there. There's fabulous stuff relating to World War I trench warfare, a wonderful D-Day scenario kind of set up, and it's a very evocative, very experiential museum. And then you go through World War I and World War II, and there's even a post-World War II kind of to today, the modern First Division exhibit. So it's an amazing place and an incredible tank yard outside, where you're probably the only place that I know of where you encourage people to get up and climb on those tanks. And if I really dug deep into the picture file, I could find a picture of Chris Anderson on a tank, but I didn't bring it in today, Chris.
Thank you. All right. So now,
and your great program. Now, if I say Ghost Army, I don't have to drink, right?
Well, no, you just said that we all have to drink.
Well, we do. Yeah.
You do. So, the Ghost Army, and thanks for your presentation. And actually, you have a replica. So the Ghost Army, just a little bit, and more, but I do, the audience that doesn't know about the deception units in World War II, and they actually had these blow-up vehicles and tanks, and Rick actually brought one, and we blew it up in the lobby of the museum. It was great.
Right.
We did, and there we are.
Yeah, I'm in that. Yeah, I am. Okay, yeah, great.
Is that the beard?
You always have that picture ready, Rick. I don't know.
It's there for every show. If we need to go with it, it's there. And that's Krewasky's mask. That's not his beard. So.
That's right. The pandemic was on. That's right. Yes.
Mr. Anderson, you've been waiting to get in a question, so please.
This gets back to where we left the topic before Rick started droning on about the Ghost Army again.
I've watched some of you guys' shows, so I came prepared a little. I'm usually,
you're getting right in the flow, man. You're doing a great job.
But we were talking about recognition and awards, and one of the things that strikes me is, of course, there are an inadequate number of battlefield commendations from the American government, but the French government, right out of the gate, members of the 369th, the unit I'm the most familiar with, are getting awarded the Croix de Guerre. By the end of the war, 171 members of the regiment, and then the regiment as a whole, are recognized by the French. So obviously, the French are impressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, in the course of the research that you've been doing, if any of the African Americans that served with the French, what they thought of the French, and in particular the French colonial troops, and conversely, what the French colonial troops may have thought about our guys.
Okay. And so what I haven't done too is I normally have a pencil and write down, because there were 3 or 4 questions there, so I'll try to remember.
Yeah,
so
and I can.
No, that's great. I think I have them in my head. So, first of all, so the French did award the African American soldiers who served with them the way they felt that they deserved to be awarded. And there are several reasons. So, as I said before, and you guys know, history is very complex because when the American soldiers came, there was a deal and a discussion that had been going back and forth about how the Americans were going to be used when they came into World War I. Were they going to fight as an American force, or were they going to be, I'm going to use the military term, task organized, which means to put units in different elements and sizes in other units. But the U.S. made a conscious decision that we're going to fight as Americans, and we're not going to give American soldiers to the French. So why is the 93rd Division given to the French? So that's a policy that was broken. We can go into that. It's very complex. And so the French were happy to get an American division. So that one division that did serve decidedly with the French, they were welcomed with open arms, and they were looked at as Americans. So to go back to the complex, and I'll talk about that image too, that's the 370th at Vauxhall. And so the French saw these African Americans, and this is very complex and gets controversial, and we talk about this in the exhibition. The French looked at African Americans as westernized Americans because their relationship with their colonial troops was a lot different. So, we can talk about that. And to go to your point about what did they think of some of the French colonial troops? So there were 17 French colonial nations that fought during World War I with the French. There were 1,500 British colonial troops that fought with the British. The Germans even had 4 colonies on Africa. So if people ask you, were black people in Africa fighting black people in World War I? Absolutely, because there were German colonies and British and French colonies right up against each other. So, but the Americans in the 93rd Division, especially that image you showed of Vauxhall and the 370th, is there were several times where some African American regiments were on the left and right flank of colonial troops. And that's where the importance of the ending of the war. The third Pan-African Movement conference happens in 1919. Right. That's not a coincidence, just like the 19th Amendment in 1920 is not a coincidence. And you say the third, people say, no, that's the first Pan-African conference. Guess when the second one was? The other two were right around the turn of the century. So why does it take almost 2 decades? So that's what World War I also did with not only African Americans, but people of African descent. We have an entire piece in the exhibition. We got several artifacts from the French, and the French were a part of our partners. I meant to mention that earlier. And so they were seeing people that looked just like them, but they couldn't speak the language. But there was a bond that was made because some African Americans do stay in France after the war. So it's an interesting, complex story.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting is, I'm in London, so there's a lot of really terrific new scholarship being done here on colonial troops that fought during the war, and there's some wonderful accounts of soldiers from the British West Indian Regiment, for example, meeting French African troops, saying, "Hey, wait a minute, what's going on here?" And to have those interactions, they're becoming more aware of the diaspora and their place in it, and it's really fascinating.
Can I say 2 points on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the Black diaspora, globalization, Banjo, the book that came out in 1929. So to go to your point about the British, I think they just made a documentary, just came out about 3 years ago. Someone in England, the documentary on the British colonial troops. And I got to see a trailer. I haven't seen it. I'm sorry to say. But yeah, you're exactly right. It globalized African Americans because number two, to go back to your question, Rick, and to tie it into Chris, is when they fought with the French, African Americans, many of them had never been treated equally by people who had skin different than them. And they realized that the way I'm living in America is really not the way it should be.
Right.
And so the Pan-African Conference, the third one in 1919, which Du Bois was on the ground floor of that, a lot of that was discussed. And there were British West Indies, French colonial troops, and African Americans, some who stayed in France, who were on the courts. And so Marseille is where the book Banjo, I think Claude McKay is the writer of that, I forget. And that's what that book is really partially all about. These people of African descent who fight during the war, who are now in France and meeting each other and talking about the present and the future, and how do we end this thing called racism because of the color of our skin.
Well, there's so many directions to go in from what you said, and I was struck by also, Chris, you remember we visited a cemetery where there are people who are from China and from India who served as essentially service troops for the British. I mean, when you watch a movie about World War I, you don't see faces of people of color. You don't see black faces. You don't see brown faces, and there's a ton of them there, and they're critical to what's going on especially for the Allies. And it's just kind of an invisible story. So I'm so thrilled that at least you and the Smithsonian and the folks who've worked on this exhibit have been able to tell a part of that story, and hopefully more parts of it will be told. And one of the people, and I do in the several hours remaining in the show. Oh, wait a minute! I do want to get to sort of the home front and a little more on the post-war impact if we can. But I also, one person who remains in France who just might be worth mentioning. Boy, Chris and I have been wanting to talk about him for 34 weeks here. Yes. Is Eugene Bullard, the Black Swallow of Death, the African American who actually goes to France before the war and ends up being with the French Foreign Legion and then becoming a pilot and being a flying ace, or maybe not an ace, but a pilot for the French, and stays there after the war and between the war periods, and is there until he essentially has to flee during the Nazi takeover in World War II. So there's just all sorts of amazing individuals who we should know, right? Who we just don't know.
Yeah, and that's why this exhibition was so important to me and a lot of folks. And at least we got the book that will still live to open up all kinds of conversations, because again, there's a lot to unpack there. And as you gave his history very well, so I'm trying to think where to jump in at. So you're right. It wasn't that he it wasn't that he stayed in Europe, like you said. He left the U.S. because his father and him had to leave town because his father had got into an altercation with his employer, and so he would not be lynched. They left town.
And he's treated better by the French, right? He's in France. It's like, whoa, things can be different than I thought in the United States.
Right. And he made it to France. He finally got there after leaving in 1912. He was from Columbus, Georgia. Got in France around 12, 13, or 14, and he joins the American Legion. So first, the
French Foreign Legion.
The French, I'm sorry, I have the American Legion on my mind. Yes, Veterans
That's all right.
Day.
You're catching up with me now. So
he joins the French Foreign Legion, and he is wounded. He fights at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. So he is in one of those two big battles. You have Verdun and Somme in 1916. He's wounded. When he gets well, he is able to join the French and learn to fly. And depending on what sources you use, some say he shot down at least one, or some say two. But he served as the first black combat pilot from the U.S. because he flew in World War I. And I say that very gently because there's no doubt that the first African American combat pilots were the Tuskegee Airmen, because Bullard didn't fly for the Americans. The Americans didn't even allow African Americans to be trained. And I've come over, I mean, there were several African Americans who applied for the Air Corps because, I wrote my dissertation, which became my book, on the service of black officers. So, I did a lot of that research in the early 90s. There were several African Americans who actually applied for the Air Corps and Air Service, as it was called, but were denied. So, and Bullard, so that's his service in the war, stellar service, and then after the war, he becomes a part of that Paris Noir.
Oh yeah, he's friends of Hemingway. He's friends of Picasso. He's in the middle of all that.
Yeah, and he learns, to fit in. He's not a musician, Rick. Chris, he learns to play the drums, and there's actual footage of him playing the drums.
Oh, and I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that
find that.
So we had 7 or 8 different videos in the exhibition, and so I would love to get my hands on some of those.
He owned a nightclub too, or
he owns a nightclub. But the other thing that's so amazing about him, World War II starts. He volunteers. He serves in the French army again.
Yeah.
And then he gets involved in resistance activities.
Yep.
Before he's finally told, you got to go.
Yep.
And I don't know, Krewasky, you may have seen it, but there's a wonderful picture of him after the war actually laying a wreath at the Arc de Triomphe.
Right, they brought him back.
Yeah.
They brought him back. And you know how he ended his life? He was an elevator operator in New York.
In the RCA building.
One of the first night show, well, not one of the first shows, he is actually being interviewed. Is it David Frost or someone who had one of the early TV shows? Yeah. There is actual footage of him in the early 1950s, because I think he passes away in 55, where he is on a night show being interviewed. And so a lot of this, as a historian, you guys know, when you have great people work on your team. Yes, I'm the curators, but we have, great museum specialists, great research assistants, project managers. And then you put these RFPs out and you get different people to do films. And I would see something and I would say, hey, I know this exists. And I've seen some of that footage and it's always amazing. Matter of fact, the first footage of African Americans is 1898, coming back from the Spanish-American War. And now it's online. I saw it years ago somewhere. Now you can Google that and you see these African American soldiers. You seen it, Chris? It sounds like you've seen it. Yeah. 1898. I'm just amazed. And so when we see those men walking down New York Avenue in 1915, there's actually footage 21 years before that of proud African Americans coming back from the Spanish-American War. And so there's actual footage of this as well. And a lot of people think that this was the day when the new Negro in 1919. And so the difference in the new Negro that's born after World War I goes to the title that you started off with, Rick, is these men. The new Negro was an aggressive new Negro, one who was not going to turn the other cheek. Do I have time to read a few words from a poem that will set this up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go for it, babe.
It's called If We... I only had 2 sips. You're getting me too. I don't know how many people are watching.
I'm done.
But the black and we have this poem in our permanent exhibition at the Smithsonian. I don't know if I put it in the world, but it's called "If We Must Die" by Claude McKay. He wrote this in 1919. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. If we must die, let us nobly die. Okay, let us nobly die. Let me make sure, because I'm skipping now. But let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. And that says it all. Although we're going to be outnumbered, although we may be attacked, we're going to fight to the death. And that's what the new Negro of 1919 was. That's what We Return Fighting was all about. And that's how it was different from the new Negro in 1875. And that's was the essence of the seeds that were planted and were being planted and being watered in 1920, 1930s, and germinates in the late 1940s and 50s and blossoms in the 1960s.
Well, and that's a beautiful poem that we were talking about before the show began, and we couldn't actually find it in that moment of conversation, so we're so glad that you did. And there's so much more to.
And again, there's no rehearsal here. I think about 2 hours before the show, you said we may talk about some of this, and so I'm glad the discussion and your history happy hour is going better than I thought. I'll give you a quick personal story. So I told my wife I was a little nervous, and that was true. And so I got my glass, and then I got my beer out of the refrigerator. And my wife looked at me and she said, aren't you about to do a program? I had to say, well, it's history happy hour. I'm supposed to show up with one.
Exactly.
So she was looking out for me.
You know, I was nervous before the show too, and the reason that I was nervous is entirely because this is, as I read the book and looked at the material, realized this is entirely a topic that we can't fit in an hour, and in fact we are failing to do that because we've left off huge amounts of it. And I want to leap ahead because I wanted to talk about the home front and sort of the things going on in America at the time and the argument about whether Black Americans should serve or not serve, and the actions of Black women who are taken in, the Yo women who are taken in as nurses but don't go over to France. But I'm struck by what you just said reading that poem, and I want to mention somebody else, because when you talk about the legacy of this service, obviously African Americans come back from World War I, and we have a couple of audience questions relating to this. It's not all positive and happy and, oh, thank you for your service, and now we're going to change things for you. And one of the people that I was struck by was a man named Charles Hamilton Houston, who served as an officer, went to France. He was in the officer school at Fort Des Moines, went to France, and his quote coming out of the service was this: "The hate and scorn showered on us Negro officers by our fellow Americans convinced me that there was no sense in my dying for a world ruled by them. I made up my mind that if I got through this war, I would study law and use my time fighting for men who could not strike back." And Krewasky, he studies law, and what does he end up going on to do?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I'll just answer your question now. So what does he go on to do? Because there's a lot before that in his family history, but he does do exactly what you said. So he comes back and he goes to law school. I think it's Harvard, right?
He does.
He goes to Harvard, and we write about it. There's so many different things. And so he is the individual that transformed what is now Howard Law School. He accreditates it. Then he becomes a part of the NAACP Defense Fund. So most people don't know that a large chunk of African-American lawyers in the 1940s had gone to school at Howard University, studied under a guy by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston, who was an officer from World War I. One of those individuals was Thurgood Marshall.
Right. He's Thurgood Marshall's mentor.
He's Thurgood Marshall's mentor. All of the defense activities that people read about when they read about Thurgood Marshall in World War II, the person that was leading and or behind that was Charles Hamilton Houston. And when Charles Hamilton Houston passes away in early 1950s, it's Marshall who says something that we would not, and I'm paraphrasing all the quotes, don't have any notes here, is it? We would not be where we are or were if it were not for Charlie. And I put that quote in the exhibition. And Charlie, he's talking about Charles Hamilton Houston. So the Brown versus the Board of Education, that's what he's referring to. Houston is a part of that crew. And so Marshall becomes the first African-American Supreme Court justice. So when I say that the seeds of the civil rights movement, and now my son is coming in and some of my luminaries are being overshadowed, when I say that the seeds of the civil rights movement are planted, and I'll say close because I know the volume, in World War I, it's folks like Charles Hamilton Houston, who is one of the luminaries. It's folks like A. Philip Randolph, who's 28 in World War I, who's the same A. Philip Randolph on August 28, 1963. And it's folks like Josephine Baker, who was the only woman that spoke in 1963. She was, of course, the young lady that was from East St. Louis, experienced the East St. Louis riots in 1917. And her quote is, I was afraid. I left the country because I was afraid to be black, and you may read that. But Charles Hamilton Houston planted the seeds for the guy that became the first African-American Supreme Court justice. And I can leave it at that because we all know what Thurgood Marshall meant for Americans, period, by being the first African-American to sit on the bench.
So, Krewasky, one of the things that strikes me, though, is every time it seems, we make a few steps forward, we take a few steps back. And in the case of World War I, it's irrefutable, the contribution that African American soldiers make. Mm-hmm. They come back. It's not a pretty picture. There are struggles between the wars. The country's starting to again overwhelmingly African Americans volunteer to serve, and they have the same fight. And there are very few. They don't see the combat that they want to because they want to serve. They want to. And Ken had asked a question. Well, there's the question. Black units served in combat in World War I, but for the most part did not in World War II. What happened between the two wars, and what happened to these units in World War II? Or what didn't happen? Yeah.
Okay. So, in order to answer that, you give me about 3 minutes because it goes back to the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and I'll just take those two.
So luckily, and I will say that luckily, we're not network television, so if we go a minute over, we don't get cut off by I Love Lucy reruns, so we're okay.
Well, this will be quick because the American Revolution did produce what was the gradual and immediate emancipation of enslaved people in northern colonies. That was some progress forward, but it became more entrenched in the South. But then after the American Civil War, when over 200,000 African Americans served, about 180,000 in the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, and over 30K in the Navy, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. This is a big subject to unpack, but I'll say when you go back and read about those amendments and that they were able to pass in America after a civil war, and there were no people of color who were part of the people voting, but that was progress. Of course, we know it was turned back after what people consider the official end of Reconstruction. And then on the Western frontier, the Buffalo Soldiers, they were making progress on the Western frontier. So when you get to World War I, a reason why the number of soldiers in World War I who are allowed to fight is very small is because, and this is a lot of what I glean, and this is not necessarily history, this is the philosophy coming into what we do as historians, is anytime you let a person fight for his country, there is no way you are going to deny that person. You may try to deny that person, but they're going to fight. So that's why the exhibition at World War II, and I mentioned this on a presentation I spoke at earlier this week, why is a World War II exhibition called Fighting for the Right to Fight? Because there were people in America who knew that if you let African Americans fight for their country, then there is no way you can continue to deny them, that social justice, that political justice, that wage justice. And so that's why there was an effort to not let African Americans be fighters in World War II. But because of the black press and people like Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall's on the scene, we don't talk about this in the exhibition, but there's Ida B. Mary McLeod Bethune. But folks like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, they're pushing it forward. But the step backwards, what happens between the wars, this study written by the Army War College in 1925, which really just castigates the service of African Americans. And I'm talking fast and trying to answer the question as best I can, because I always tell people we need to have these conversations and symposiums if we're going to continue to move our country forward. Because number one, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Jewish Americans, women, and African Americans, and white Americans, we're Americans. We're not going anywhere. So we have to figure this out. And that's, my point of kind of bringing this to the thought conversation of today. That's why there was a push not to let African Americans fight in World War One and World War II because of the progress that was slowly happening because they fought in the American Revolution and the Civil War. And I'm skipping some wars in between that they fought in, and they fought on the Western frontier. Do you know that 1 in every 5 cavalry men on the Western frontier were African American? Right. There are only 10 cavalry units. The 9th and 10th were 2 of them. 1 in 12 infantrymen on the Western frontier was African American. There were only 25 infantry regiments. The 24th and 25th were African Americans. And so that was making a difference. And in World War One, the push was so heavy that all of those, not all of them, there were some who were, picked to go to OCS, but those soldiers who fought in World War One, African Americans, they weren't the well-trained African American veterans. The 9th and the 10th and the 24th and the 25th were not sent overseas. That's a whole subject we can unpack in another discussion.
Well, I think we're going to have another discussion.
We come back. Did Rick scare you off?
I have to get nervous again because this is a different history happy hour on a Sunday with the beverages. But it's a great concept. I watch some of your shows, and so
and this has been a most illuminating hour and certainly one of our best. And so we really, really appreciate the time. Krewasky Salter, who, as we mentioned, he is a former associate curator with the Smithsonian. He is the current executive director of the 1st Division Museum in Wheaton, Illinois, a fabulous place to visit. And he is a retired colonel in the United States Army, and also an excellent organization that we appreciate the efforts of. Krewasky, thank you so much, and look forward to having you back on the show to continue this discussion and talk a little bit more about the World War II part of the story, because I know that you've curated a permanent exhibit on that at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And let me give a plug for the book that accompanies the exhibit, which is We Return Fighting. And I was mentioning Krewasky wrote about a third, or between a third and a half, this book. He still didn't get his name on the cover, so we have to work on that. But that's the Smithsonian. What are we going to say about that? But it's a terrific book. Lots of also great images in there, and lots of great text in there. So I highly recommend that. Krewasky Salter, thank you so much for joining us.
Krewasky.
All right, Chris and Rick, thank you.
Take care.
Wow. Whew. That was great.
Yes.
That was fascinating. And so, Chris, I have a wonderful history happened here.
Yes.
That relates directly to this story. And it is about 2 miles south of me at 35th and Martin Luther King Drive. There is a memorial there to the, we talked about it in the show, it was the 8th Regiment of the Illinois National Guard, which became the 370th Regiment, part of, I think, I've gotten 2 things wrong so far.
93rd Division.
93rd Division, okay.
And the 8th Illinois predates the 15th New York, and they were the ultimate African-American militia unit, and they inspired the creation of the 15th.
God bless you, Chris, for having information.
Did I interrupt you enough?
Like that. You are a very knowledgeable man. Has anybody ever told you that?
No.
And it's this is some close-ups of some part of this memorial. 137 members of the 370th Infantry Division died in Europe, and their names are on the memorial. And I would say that what's also part of this story and kind of sad is that this is in large part a forgotten memorial. And I think even a lot of people in Chicago barely know it's there. And I read online that many of the people who served in this unit, there's very few photographs and artifacts left because, they came back, they were not being well treated. It wasn't a happy story, and they just thought it was something they wanted to kind of forget about. So it's kind of a sad tale there.
And I just want to, sort of a history here thing, in the process of getting ready for this show, if you do a search on YouTube, WNET Harlem Hellfighters, back in the 70s, public television in New York did a program about the Harlem Hellfighters, and it's chock-a-block full of interviews with the guys in the unit.
Oh, wow.
Which was just really neat.
We'll take a look at that. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us for a wonderful History Happy Hour. And please come back and join us again next week.
See you soon, guys. Be safe.
And now I have to find the open. Oh, but it's not the open, it's the close now.
It's the close now.